In a Tennessee courtroom in 1874, a woman sat and waited to find out what she was. Her name was Martha Zimmerman. There was land at stake, left to her by a white relative, and the entire case came down to one question that the court felt perfectly comfortable answering on her behalf. Was there African ancestry in her family? If the answer came back yes, she lost everything. Not a trial about anything she had done. A trial about what she was. Picture the room. Men in wool suits in a Tennessee summer, studying her face the way you'd study a fence line in a property dispute, preparing to rule on her blood and then go home to dinner. Her lawyer understood exactly what game was being played, and he played it brilliantly. He argued that her family were not African at all, that they descended from ancient Phoenician sailors who had drifted to Portugal, and from Portugal to America. He won. She kept the land. And here is the part I have not been able to shake since I started reading about this. At that exact moment in American history, the same decade, the same mountain range, the country was being handed a beautiful story about this region. That the southern Appalachians were the last preserved pocket of pure Anglo-Saxon America. Isolated, untouched, unmixed, white. That story lasted 100 years. It shaped school books and folk festivals, and every photograph the rest of the country ever saw of a mountain family. And that courtroom was running the whole time. So let me tell you where the story came from, because this is the part almost nobody knows. The myth of white Appalachia was not an accident, and it was not a slow drift of public opinion. It had an author, it had a publication date, and it was written, in part, to raise money. In March of 1899, the president of a small Kentucky college published an essay in the Atlantic Monthly. His name was William Goodell Frost. The essay was called Our Contemporary Ancestors in the Southern Mountains, and the argument was as elegant as it was destructive. The people of the Southern Mountains were not backward, they were preserved. Living fossils. Colonial Americans who had somehow survived into the modern age, still spinning cloth by hand, still speaking the old words, still carrying the founding stock of the nation in their blood. For northern readers with money, this was irresistible. Here was a population you could feel patriotic about saving. And it worked. The donations came. Now here is the detail that turns this from history into something that sits in your stomach. Frost's college had been founded as an interracial school in the American South, a genuinely radical thing to be. But by the 1890s, Northern philanthropists were quietly losing their appetite for funding black education in the South. Their enthusiasm was moving toward a different project, the rescue of pure Anglo-Saxon mountaineers. Some of the college's own black alumni watched Frost's new pitch land and understood immediately what it was going to cost them. You can still read what that college's library says about the region today. It says the mountains were always a tri-racial place, from the moment Europeans and Africans arrived among native nations who had been there for thousands of years. And it says Appalachia became whitewashed. That is the institution that helped build the myth, admitting in its own words that the myth erased people. And once a myth like that exists, it needs maintaining. In the 1920s and 30s, when mountain folk festivals became a national fashion, some of them explicitly barred black musicians from the stage. The sound of Appalachia was being curated in real time, packaged as ancient, English, and unmixed, with the door held shut from the inside. Which brings me to the instrument. If I asked you right now to picture Appalachian music, you would hear a banjo. It is the sound of the entire region. Porch music, mountain music, the thing people mean when they say old time. The banjo is West African, not influenced by, not vaguely related to. The Smithsonian's own account of it is completely unambiguous. The instrument was created by enslaved Africans and their descendants in the Caribbean and colonial North America, rebuilt from the memory of West African gourd lutes that nobody was allowed to carry onto a ship because the knowledge traveled in people's hands instead of their luggage. For its first 2 centuries here, it was played almost entirely by black musicians. The single most recognizable symbol of white Appalachia is an African instrument. Hold on to that, because it is the shape of this whole story. The evidence was never hidden. It was sitting in the room the entire time, making the sound everybody loved. So, who exactly got erased? That is where this stops being about essays and starts being about lives. Start with the thing everyone believes about the mountains, that slavery didn't reach up there, that the high country was too poor, too steep, too full of small, independent farmers for any of that. It's a comforting idea. It is also completely false. Slavery existed in every Appalachian county in 1860. Not most, every one. Roughly 1 in 5 Appalachian households held enslaved people. And because mountain farms were small, the enslaved people there often lived in ones and twos, isolated from anyone who shared their language, their memory, their family. Then there were the salt works. Along the Kanawha River in what is now West Virginia, in a green valley hemmed in by forested ridges, the salt furnaces burned around the clock. 6 days a week, day and night, in a country of cold creeks and hardwood. Salt was money. Salt was also so brutal that the men who ran it worked out it was cheaper to lease human beings than to buy them, because a leased worker who died was somebody else's loss. Within a single generation, that one county went from a few hundred enslaved people to more than 3,000. Tending kettles, hauling coal out of unsafe holes in the hillside, packing barrels in heat that never stopped. If you have ever been told there was no slavery in Appalachia, hold that image. 3,000 people, in the middle of the mountains, working furnaces that never went out. But the number that actually broke something in me is a different one. The mountains were not just a place where slavery existed. The mountains were a supply. As mountain tobacco lost its market, the export became people. By the eve of the Civil War, roughly 3 out of every 5 enslaved people in Appalachia had been sold south to the cotton plantations. Which means the defining experience of Black life in those mountains was not the work. It was the leaving. And the research on this is specific and merciless. About 1 in 3 would be sold away from their family before they turned 40. The season for it was the end of the year, hiring season, settling up season. So the months we now decorate and sentimentalize were the months mountain families spent waiting to find out who was going. That is not a footnote to Appalachian history. That is Appalachian history, and it was removed from the picture so completely that most people who grow up in those counties never hear it. Then the coal came, and the mountains filled up. Between the turn of the century and the 1930s, roughly a quarter of all the coal miners in southern West Virginia were Black. Not a handful, not a token presence. A quarter of the workforce in the industry that defined the region. They came up from Virginia and Alabama and Mississippi, some of them following the railroad crews that had carved the tunnels through those ridges. And they built churches, baseball teams, barbershops, funeral homes, schools, whole towns wedged into the narrow ground between the mountains, with the smell of coal smoke in everything and a train whistle marking the hours. In 50 years, West Virginia's Black population grew more than 4-fold, and one of the young men who went down into those Fayette County mines was named Carter G. Woodson. He listened to the older miners tell their histories underground. He went on to become the historian who created what we now call Black History Month. The man who taught America to record Black history learned to value it in a West Virginia coal mine. Inside the region, America was simultaneously being told contained no Black people at all. I don't think I need to editorialize on that one. It just sits there. Which raises the obvious question. If a quarter of the workforce was Black, where did everyone go? Machines. After the Second World War, the coal industry mechanized, and the jobs that had pulled 100,000 people into those hollows simply evaporated. The Black share of West Virginia's miners fell by half within a few years of the war. Then it kept falling. Every decade, lower. By the 1980s, it was barely a rounding error in an industry Black men had helped build. Whole towns emptied. The churches closed, the ball fields grew over, and families who had made a life in those hollows packed up and went north to Detroit, to Cleveland, to Columbus. And then the cameras arrived. The picture of Appalachia that most Americans still carry in their heads was made in the 1960s, when a president declared a war on poverty with these mountains specifically in mind. Photographers came. The images went everywhere, into magazines and living rooms, and eventually into textbooks. And they were taken after the Exodus, in counties the machines had already emptied out. So the country looked at Appalachia, saw a white region, and concluded it had always been one. It hadn't. It was made one. First by an essay, then by the law, and finally by economics. And each stage made the stage before it look like it had been true all along. And I should say, if you're still with me here, this is exactly the kind of story this channel exists for. The record that got edited and the people who survived the editing. Subscribing helps me keep pulling these up out of the archives, and you'll want to stay for the next part, because that's where the paperwork stops being careless and starts being a weapon. Because here is what the DNA finally did. Along the Tennessee and Virginia line, in Hancock and Hawkins counties, on and around a long wooded spine of land called Newman's Ridge, there had lived for generations a group of families with darker skin than their neighbors. Their neighbors had a name for them, and it was a slur, Melungeon. And for 2 centuries, those families told the world a story about where they came from. They were Portuguese, shipwrecked sailors, ancient Mediterranean stock, anything at all, except African. Go there today, and it is beautiful, and it is quiet. Long ridgelines running northeast, fog sitting in the hollows most mornings, small roads, small county seats, the kind of place where the same handful of surnames fills a whole cemetery. Those surnames are the point. They were the families the neighbors whispered about for 200 years. In 2012, a team of genetic genealogists finally stopped arguing about the legends and tested the actual lines, 69 unbroken father-to-son lines and 8 unbroken mother-to-daughter lines, every one of them traced back on paper to a family recorded as Melungeon in the old county documents. Think about what that test is really asking. Not, what do you look like? Not, what did your grandmother say? It asks the one question no census taker, no jury, and no lawyer in 1874 could actually answer. Who were the men and who were the women at the very beginning of this family? The paternal lines came back sub-Saharan African. The maternal lines came back Northern and Central European. Not Portuguese, not Turkish, not Phoenician. The families had begun, most likely, in Colonial Virginia in the middle of the 1600s, in the brief window when African and European indentured servants worked the same fields, lived in the same quarters, and married each other, because the laws that would make that a crime had not been written yet. The researcher who led that work, Roberta Estes, has been open about what happened next. A lot of people were furious. Families who had held the Portuguese story for 200 years did not receive it as a discovery. They received it as an accusation. And that reaction is the most human thing in this entire story, because those families were not lying for fun. Go back to Martha Zimmerman in that courtroom. Her lawyer didn't invent the Phoenician theory because he loved ancient history. He invented it because he understood the rule perfectly. In that society, being foreign and dark was survivable. Being African was not. The Portuguese story wasn't a fantasy. It was armor. It was the thing that kept a family's land, kept a marriage license valid, kept children in a school, kept a man's vote from being challenged at the county courthouse. Every generation that repeated it was doing the arithmetic of survival, and every generation that repeated it lost a little more of the actual names. Then Virginia made it official. In 1924, the state passed the Racial Integrity Act, which sorted every human being in Virginia into exactly 2 boxes, white or colored. There was no third box. And the man in charge of the filing cabinet was the state registrar, a physician and committed eugenicist named Walter Plecker. Plecker ran vital statistics for over 30 years. And what he did with that authority is one of the quietest atrocities in American administrative history. When a midwife or a clerk wrote Indian on a birth certificate, Plecker would find it. He would cross it out. He would write colored instead. He did this to living people. He did this to the dead, reaching back through decades of records to retroactively change who families had been. He wrote to registrars across the state, instructing them that Virginia Indians no longer existed, that there was no such thing as a Virginia native family unmixed with African ancestry, and therefore no such thing as a Virginia Indian at all. A man with a pen in an office deciding that entire nations were finished. And I want to be precise about the human scale of this, because altering records sounds like a filing problem, and it was nothing of the sort. It meant a couple could not legally marry. It meant a child was sent to a different school. It meant a family's own account of its own grandmother became, in the eyes of the state, a false statement. Whole communities were told, in writing, by a government they paid taxes to, that they were not who they had always been. There are letters. He wrote to registrars, clerks, midwives, chasing individual families through the paperwork year after year with the terrible patience of a man who believed he was doing science. They call it paper genocide, and once you understand it, you cannot unsee it, because the consequences are not historical. Tribal recognition in this country depends on documentation. Plecker knew that. The damage was designed to outlive him, and it did. His law stayed on the books until 1967. And this is where the mountains give you the counter-story, because the erasure was never total. In the Great Smokies, when the removal soldiers came through in the 1830s, roughly 800 Cherokee did not go. Some held land protected under earlier treaties. Some simply went up, into the high coves and the laurel thickets and the cold creek drainages where a man on a horse cannot follow you and a man on foot will not want to. If you have ever walked that country, you know why it worked. The rhododendron grows in tangles a person has to crawl through. The ridges fold over each other so completely that a valley 2 miles away might as well be in another state. Outsiders would later call all of that emptiness and write about it as untouched wilderness. It wasn't empty. It was full of people who had decided not to be found. They stayed. Their descendants are still there, on the Kuala boundary beside the national park, a nation of more than 14,000 citizens today, living in mountains they never once left. That is worth sitting with. The most famous story about Native people in Appalachia is a story about them leaving. And the truest thing in those mountains is the people who refuse to. Which brings me to the moment in all of this that I keep coming back to. It happened in 1991, and it happened in a library. A young Kentucky poet named Frank X. Walker went looking for a word. He was black. He was Appalachian. He had grown up in those hills the way his neighbors had, with the same porches and the same music and the same relationship to the land. And when he looked up the definition of Appalachian, he found that the dictionary defined it as a white resident of the mountains. Think about what that does to a person. It isn't a slur. It isn't some stranger yelling at him from a truck. It is a reference book. Neutral, authoritative, sitting on a library shelf, calmly informing him that the place he is from does not include him. His family had been in those hills for generations. The dictionary had been printed in a city he'd never lived in, and the dictionary was the thing everybody believed. So he made a new word, Appalachia. He said it out loud, and then other people said it, and then artists and writers and musicians said it, and the word did what the region's own dictionary had refused to do. It made room. That word is now in the Oxford American Dictionary. He wrote his own people back into the language, one syllable at a time. That is the thing I want you to take out of this video, if you take nothing else. The erasure was done with paperwork, and so was the repair. Now here is what the DNA cannot do, and I want to be honest about it, because the honesty is the whole point. Genetics is very good at proving presence. In the largest study of its kind, researchers looked at nearly 150,000 Americans who described themselves as white and asked a simple question: What's actually in there? Nationally, about 1 in 25 carried measurable African ancestry. In the states of the Deep South, it climbed to roughly 1 in 8. And here is the detail that makes it land in your chest instead of your head. At that level, you are not talking about some misty prehistoric mixing. You are talking about an ancestor within about the last 200 years. Somebody with a name, somebody who had a face, and a house, and a grave that is probably still out there under grass somebody mows. But genetics cannot tell you which relative was written down as something they were not. It cannot tell you what a woman was thinking when she taught her children to say Portuguese. It cannot restore a nation's records, and it should never be used to decide who belongs to a tribe, because tribal citizenship is about a community, its law, and its continuity, not about a test result. The records were the weapon. The community is the truth. Those are different things, and they always have been. So a great deal of this remains permanently unresolved, and I mean permanently. Nobody can tell you how many families walked out of the mountains and into whiteness and simply never mentioned it again. Nobody can tell you how many indigenous Virginians appear in the official record as something they were not, because the men who altered the record were thorough. Some descendants today test and find what they expected and feel relief. Some test and find something nobody in the family ever said out loud. Some do not want to know, and I understand that too. After enough generations, the silence isn't a secret anymore. It's the family itself. And there is a tension in this that I don't think gets talked about enough. When a family has spent 6 generations building a story that kept them safe, a test result does not feel like liberation. It feels like the thing they were protecting the children from. That's why the 2012 findings landed the way they did. Those families weren't rejecting science. They were reacting the way anyone reacts when a stranger walks up and undoes the work of everyone who came before them. The kindest way I've heard it put is that they weren't hiding their ancestry. They were hiding their children. There is no study coming that fixes this. That's not how it works. What we get instead is a region of 26 million people across 13 states that contained tri-racial ancestry from the beginning, and a 100-year story that insisted otherwise so successfully that most Americans still believe it. So let me take you back to that courtroom. 1874. Martha Zimmerman sits and waits while men decide what she is. Her lawyer stands up and tells them her family sailed from ancient Phoenicia to Portugal to the mountains of Tennessee. It works. The land stays hers. She won. She kept the farm and the standing and the future of her children. And she did it by proving she was not the thing she was. 138 years later, someone finally asked her family's DNA the question the court had asked her, and the answer that came back was the one the whole system had been built to punish. African fathers, European mothers, colonial Virginia. A love story, most likely, from the brief moment before the law made it a crime. She never got to know that. Neither did her children or her grandchildren, or most of the generations after them. They inherited the armor instead, and they wore it well, and it worked. But the armor was never in the blood. The blood had been telling the truth the entire time. Quietly, patiently, for 6 generations, waiting for somebody to finally ask. What would you do if a document told you your grandmother was someone she wasn't? Would you go looking for her or let her rest?